Going into the summer of 2010, one of the most promising and interesting movies to be released was Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the kind of North American debut of British director Edgar Wright, with all of Hollywood's might and power behind him, leading a big budget movie. And it looked really cool from the trailers, coming off of the cult comic book Scott Pilgrim by Brian Lee O'Malley, with a truly amazing Comic-Con panel and a promising young cast. What could go wrong until it totally bombed? This is How Did Scott Pilgrim vs. the World Bomb at the Box Office? Scott Pilgrim vs. the World was a really promising big movie for Edgar Wright. Universal was really behind him with this one. This was almost an $100 million movie. It cost about $90 million or 88 to 90 or whatever, but with tax rebates it cost about 60. So if you see it listed that way, that's why. Hollywood budgets are a little bit hard to nail down. There's an exact science to knowing how much they spent on it, but that's at least what we know. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World was originally released as a kind of counter-programming measure in the late summer. The big movie to be released that weekend was the first Expendables, which actually cost more than Scott Pilgrim, but opened at number 1 with $34 million. Now, Scott Pilgrim opened at number 5th with $10 million, which is bad, especially when you look at the films that beat it, which was Eat, Pray, Love, which opened at number 2. It was also its first week at $23 million. It was one of 3 big releases that weekend, and 2 other movies that had been out for a little bit. The Other Guys, which was number 1 the previous weekend and made about $17 million, and then Inception, which had been out for 5 weeks and made $11 million, all of which made more than Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. It didn't get any better for Scott Pilgrim at all. It made $31 million domestically and a total of $47 million total. And Expendables was a comeback for Stallone, even though he had like Rambo and a Rocky film and all that, but this was kind of like a big comeback for him, one of his many comebacks. Him teaming up with all these big action heroes. There was a lot of anticipation around the Expendables, which didn't help Scott Pilgrim because people, don't normally see more than one movie, and if there's like, I've never seen all these guys together in one movie, I have to see this movie, and Bruce Willis and Arnold Schwarzenegger are going to be in that one shot, I have to see this whatever. So they didn't see Scott Pilgrim because of that. The other thing is the comic that this is based on. I know a lot of people on the internet love that comic, and I have not read it, and I'm not trying to talk any shit about it, but it just really wasn't big enough. When we talk about comic properties that people really want to see, they're things they have sentimental or emotional attachments to or had heard of, and Scott Pilgrim just really wasn't that. Universal and Edgar Wright decided to make this big budget movie based on that, and opening it against the Expendables just isn't really going to work. You can't take, hey, here's this new thing, and then they're like, yeah, but like Stallone's with Dolph Lundgren again, and when am I going to see that again? I sort of get like there was more anticipation for an Expendables film than like an unproven property you probably weren't sure of, at least for general audiences who maybe wouldn't know who Edgar Wright was. The other thing, and I'm going to say I don't agree with this point necessarily. I do and I don't. The lead of this film, Michael Cera, I think is another big reason for it not doing as well financially. Now, Michael Cera kind of burst onto the movie scene. He was obviously in Arrested Development and started building momentum. And then he was in Superbad and then Juno in the same year, both of which made $100 million. Now, Superbad, I understand part of the success of that was him. He was on the poster. He was one of the leads with Jonah Hill. I get that. Juno, even though he is on a lot of the posters, I don't feel like anybody saw Juno and was like, man, that Michael Cera guy is real good in that movie. It's like he's kind of like no one you think about, even though he is central to the plot and everything. But there was a feeling like, hey, this guy was just in 2 really big movies. He's clearly got a promising career. And then Nick and Nora came out, and that actually did do okay. I mean, it didn't cost like anything, and I think it made about cost. Basically, it cost about $10 million to make. They spent like nothing in promotion probably. So they kept giving him bigger projects, and Edgar Wright cast him in Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. But people naturally, if you ever talk to someone about Michael Cera, they'll go, oh, I hate that guy. I've never really understood the hate for Michael Cera. I kind of like him to a certain degree. I've never really hated him that much, but people have different views on that. A previous film that he had come out, the last film that really was sold on him and his name alone, Youth and Revolt, which made about $15 million total and didn't do very well at all. It kind of got pushed around the release schedule. I remember I was kind of interested in it, and then I did see it and it was fine or whatever, but it was kind of quirky. I'm sure if I was 14 I would have liked it more. But it opened at number 9 in January, which is bad, made about $6 million, and then, had a total of about $15 million. And it just seemed like audiences just didn't like Michael Cera. I'm not sure what the deal is with the Michael Cera hate, but people just didn't like him. Then you come to Scott Pilgrim, After that whole thing happened, he didn't star in another movie for like 3 years. And then anytime he would lead a movie, it'd be a smaller indie film. It seems like this was kind of the end of him in Hollywood because nothing was really sticking with him. And I don't necessarily think he's a lead. I do like him in Scott Pilgrim. I even like him in Youth and Revolt. I don't think he's ever really given a truly bad performance, but people didn't feel that way. And his next film would be Crystal Fairy, which made a total of $200,000, but only opened at most in 20 theaters. He kind of seemed to lay low after that. This Is the End, which did very well 3 years later. It was in the Lego Movie and Sausage Party, and he still does do quite a few things, but it just doesn't seem like audiences wanted him, and I think that was kind of a hindrance as to why this movie didn't do well, unfortunately. The other thing that I hear that this film gets blamed for is its Comic-Con panel, which I always find weird because there was this weird thing about Comic-Con where people sort of were like, there was a time where it was so important movies would just get approved because of how cool and how well they do at Comic-Con. And that's like sort of true, but sort of like not. It's best not to look at Comic-Con the way people do under the guise of this, but basically it had an amazing Comic-Con panel. They had everyone there. I've read reports of it. I remember reading reports and like, it sounds so cool. Edgar Wright walked everyone from the panel to a screening of the movie. Then Metric played all their Clash of Demon Head songs right after the movie. Almost any press reports you read from that panel was very glowing. They had Nick Frost and Simon Pegg walk on stage and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, you're actually not in the movie.
I should have read, not appearing in this film, Simon Pegg and Nick Frost."
And then walk off. Michael Cera wore a Captain America outfit. There's all sorts of funny things that happened at that panel. It sounded like pretty epically amazing, and all footage looks really cool. It just sounds like they really pulled out all the stops for this awesome Comic-Con panel, and they had advertising everywhere for Scott Pilgrim, which was also, by the way, right before Scott Pilgrim came out, so it sort of made sense that they'd pull out all the stops at a comic book convention for a movie of Scott Pilgrim. But it seems like people blame like maybe the Comic-Con perception isn't that important for the movie going public, and I agree and I don't, because one thing is the movie that beat Scott Pilgrim had a Comic-Con panel in Hall H directly before Scott Pilgrim, and that was The Expendables. In addition to that, Comic-Con 2010 is also the Comic-Con that the Avengers premiered all together. We're all there. They showed the entire cast. They're like, hey, Edward Norton's not in this anymore, and we have Mark Ruffalo and stuff. And like, that was all that Comic-Con. So to say Comic-Con had gone too far is like, well, not really, because you just literally the same weekend have a success story of a big panel and a signing, and they had a lot of press of the Expendables stuff from Comic-Con that worked. Thing with Comic-Con, it's just another promotional stop. You can be a host on SNL to promote a movie, and it can be an amazing episode. That doesn't mean your movie's going to make $100 million. You can be a guest on Kelly and Ryan or whatever talk show and do a really, really great interview. That doesn't mean you're going to make tons and tons of money and have a box office hit. This is just one of the things. I find that to be like really sort of ridiculous. They're like, well, they're pushing it so much at Comic-Con. Look at these stupid idiots. They're pushing it to their audience that would really actually like it. It's the core audience. They sell Marvel movies and DC movies at Comic-Cons also because, hey, the people who are going to see that movie are right there. You want to make sure they know about it. I don't really think it makes a lot of sense to blame Comic-Con. I think it's kind of misinformed to say that. It's misunderstanding movie marketing, really. But then you get to Edgar Wright and how Edgar Wright got in this situation, really. He had 2 successful films, Shaun of the Dead and then Hot Fuzz. Now, Shaun of the Dead was kind of a cult hit. It did well in America. It only made about 13 million, I believe, and did all right. And then he came out with Hot Fuzz, which did better in America, made about 23, but then internationally did a total of 80 million, mostly because it was an action thing and people like action, and he was able to have sort of a hit with that. And I think people were excited by Edgar Wright. I know the Hollywood establishment was really into the idea of Edgar Wright and Nick Frost and Simon Pegg and like kind of inundating them into Hollywood. You know, Simon Pegg had just been in Star Trek. They also would have Paul coming out, also from Universal. So Hollywood was really high on these guys. I've read reports about how when Shaun of the Dead came to LA and those guys came, they were kind of embraced with open arms. Like, Hollywood loved these guys. And Edgar Wright was a very promising director. And so promising, in fact, Universal very much wanted to be in business with these guys. And in fact, they've actually said that several times in box office things, that they sort of knew this movie wouldn't do well, which is sort of an interesting twist on this whole thing. And it's because they wanted to be in the Edgar Wright business. They courted him pretty heavily. They seemed to really like Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz because they courted both him and made the film that Simon Pegg and Nick Frost wrote. Paul but they really wanted to be in the Edgar Wright business. They felt there was a future in that. And Universal seemed to want to actually do different things. They'd finance all sorts of crazier films, from Land of the Lost to Paul to Your Highness to even The Adjustment Bureau. At this time, they were a little edgier, a little different. They tried to make like films that were sort of like cultish and give them a bigger budget. That's mostly credited, from a few sites credit Universal Pictures chairman Mark Schumacher or whatever, who was fired in October of 2009, although that didn't seem to affect the release of this film. This was something Universal was trying to really push, like different kind of movies at the time. And eventually they kind of stopped. Now, during kind of an argument between two internet film journalists, you have Harry Knowles, who got mad that Universal wouldn't make In the Mouth of Madness, the Guillermo del Toro movie, which never happened and even had Tom Cruise set to star and James Cameron producing, and Universal decided to walk away from it. Drew McWeeny argued that Universal kind of had too many expensive flops, and he brings up Scott Pilgrim and then Paul and Your Highness and The Adjustment Bureau, and it's a great piece. He wrote it for the former Hit Fix that isn't around anymore, but it's a great article kind of about what was going on with Universal at the time. This shows you that the studio did believe in Scott Pilgrim. I mean, they really did try to sell those movies. It's not like all those movies were heavily promoted, had tons of advertising promoted to the right people, like Scott Pilgrim at Comic-Con. But I think one of the biggest things is that you're selling this film mainly to young people, to people in their 20s and 30s. And we're like a year out from the Great Recession. I would say the Great Recession was still going on. You're selling this movie to the group that's hit the hardest, and you're expecting them to see different kinds of movies at the time, when rubbing together $2 to make 4 cents is not even working for them. And this film really was a kind of victim of the recession, of a DVD bubble that was about to burst, because one of the reasons they'd make these cult films is actually because they would sell well on DVD, and that was about to go away. And it just all kind of didn't work out for Scott Pilgrim. I don't think Scott Pilgrim is a bad movie. I just think financially it made like literally no sense. And I think Universal tried. They wanted to be in the Edgar Wright business at the time. Obviously regime changes sort of messed up that, so they couldn't entirely like keep that relationship going. And his next film, The World's End, would be released by Focus, which is a subsidiary of Universal. So I guess they did continue that relationship. Not that World's End did like that much better. And then after that, Edgar Wright finally had his honest to God hit with Baby Driver, and that was with TriStar and not at all with Universal. So the courting and the kind of spending on an auteur and kind of giving them the film he wanted with all the sorts of money, giving him kind of access to having a huge Hollywood film, didn't really work out with that studio. It worked out with someone else in the end. I still like Scott Pilgrim. I think maybe if they had marketed it differently and not had it go up against The Expendables, which is a little stupid, frankly, it maybe could have done better, but I think it's probably highly unlikely this film would have been a hit, or been a hit to the extent where it would have made a lot of money and made financial sense, which unfortunately Scott Pilgrim didn't. So that's why and how Scott Pilgrim bombed at the box office.